All right, welcome everyone to the Velero community meeting. Today is Tuesday, September 3rd. Glad to have everyone here. I'm going to go ahead and share the agenda that we have for today, which is pretty light. All right, so before we get started, just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded. We'll post the recording up onto our YouTube channel later on today or later this week. So just please keep that in mind as you're commenting. So today, not much in the agenda. We would like to just do a quick review of kind of what we've been working on and in particular reviewing what's in the 1.2 release scope and talk a little bit about what we've been doing there and what's coming up there. And then we do have several issues and PRs that we wanted to open up an opportunity for some discussion on. There are some different feature requests and ideas that we need to collect some more input on. So we'll pull those up and see if anyone has any input or any opinions on those. So I guess I'll start just by pulling up the ZenHub board, which we use for planning our milestones, and I actually have it up in this tab here. So right now I have it filtered to the 1.2 milestone. And so if you're interested to see what we're currently working on and kind of what's in scope for this release, you can take a look at this view. What we have in the release backlog is basically everything that we are planning to tackle within the 1.2 milestone. And then we have a number of items that are in progress, a number of items that are being reviewed or tested, and then items that have already been merged. So the big themes that we have for 1.2, which we've talked about in these meetings before, are first of all continuing to work on moving the RESTIC integration towards GA. So we made a number of changes in the 1.1 cycle to continue to improve the stability and usability there, and we have several more that we're working on for this cycle. I think we're not sure yet whether we'll be able to declare it GA at the end of 1.2 or whether that will push to 1.3. But I think we're definitely continuing to make some significant improvements to the stability and usability. And you can dive into some of these issues that are labeled RESTIC or RESTIC GA for more details on those. We're also continuing to work on our CSI integration. Maybe Nolan can give a little bit of an update on that in a minute, but we've been working on kind of iterating on our design for how we want to integrate CSI snapshot support into Velero. And we feel pretty good about the design we have now, but we are also waiting for kind of the upstream Kubernetes CSI APIs to stabilize. And it looks like those are not going to be moving to beta status for the 1.16 release. So we may be in a little bit of a holding pattern here while that sort of settles. But definitely still open to input here on the design proposal that we have up. Beyond that, we have a number of sort of housekeeping items. So we will be moving the Velero GitHub repository out of the Heptio organization and into a VMware organization as part of this release cycle. The move is not strictly tied to the release of 1.2, but it's something that we'll be working on during this milestone. So more changes to come there. And then we're also looking at taking the cloud provider plugins that we have that are inside the Velero repository right now. So that's AWS, Azure, and GCP, and moving each of those into their own separate repos. We want to do this so that they're sort of on equal footing with any external plugins that are contributed. It also helps us make sure that the kind of the development experience for those plugins is good, and that if there are any improvements that need to be made, that we can see it kind of in the same way as any external contributors. And it also allows those things to kind of evolve and be released potentially on their own cycles. So we'll be doing a bunch of work there, which hopefully should have minimal to no impact for users of those things, but will require a bunch of behind the scenes changes. I think that covers the main set of themes. Did anyone else on the team have anything else to add there?
I just wanted to toss in on the on the CSI support, the thing we're trying to work through on the Velero side is how to make sure we can keep our rustic support enabled so that it works the same as it does today with the CSI support. Based on how the design implements things, we kind of have to make sure that we're not doing extra work that doesn't need to be done. Also on the CSI snapshot APIs, they got delayed due to some late discussions last week on modifying some of the APIs that are involved with taking snapshots, and specifically the data source for a PVC. And those discussions ended up making it so the team missed the deadline for moving things.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, so we'll be continuing to kind of keep informed of what's going on upstream, see if there's any input that we can provide that'll be helpful there, and hope to be able to move this forward over the coming months. So I'll switch back to the agenda. Did anyone else have any other specific items they wanted to cover about the 1.2 release?
We're also moving our Docker container publishing process to Travis this week. So it's currently on a private Jenkins server that's getting retired, and that will be moved out into the public. So they'll be a little bit more visible.
Yep, and as for now, we will the image will be published to the same place, to the GCR repository under our registry in the Heptio Images project. But there may be changes coming to that in the future. So we'll make sure to keep everyone posted and publish details on how to migrate as and when that's needed. All right, well, if there's, are there any questions from any of the other attendees, questions or comments on what we've covered so far? All right, so we'll move on to the handful of items that we have for sort of open discussion here, and mainly like to solicit input from anyone who has opinions on these, and also just raise them so that folks are aware that these things are being discussed. The first one I'll go to is there's an open PR right now, which is a design proposal. And this is a proposal for a two-stage volume backup or volume snapshot API. This PR was, the design doc was written by Satyam, who works on the OpenABS project. And so the idea behind this design proposal is that right now when Velero takes snapshots of persistent volumes, it's essentially just making a single API call through our plugin mechanism and eventually to the cloud provider to create a snapshot of the volume that's being used by the PV. And in a public cloud world, for example, if you're running on AWS, this is kind of a sufficient workflow because when you create a snapshot using the EBS API, you get a point in time snapshot that's created, and then behind the scenes AWS kind of replicates the data that existed at that point in time off to a durable backend. So they replicate the data off to S3, but that's all kind of transparent to the user or the API caller. You don't need to really track the replication of that data. And so Velero is originally designed for those public cloud provider APIs and just makes a single API call. For some other storage platforms though, it's actually, it's better modeled as at least a two-step process where first you kind of create a snapshot, which is a kind of just an instantaneous reference to the state of the data in the volume. And then separately, you are actually going to replicate that data off to a durable backend somewhere. And it could be in the cloud or some other location within your data center. And so this design proposal basically walks through enhancing the Velero plugin API to add a separate API call for uploading snapshot data into that durable backend. And we've started to have some discussion on this PR. So some of the folks on the team have started to add some comments to it. But we're definitely interested in making sure that any enhancements that we put in here make sense for all of the storage providers that would need to take advantage of this. So I think we're interested in continuing to solicit feedback on this document. So anyway, I'll pause there and see if anyone has any questions or comments on this so far.
I've got a comment based on my experience of backup, which goes back a long time, let's say. This need for a two-stage backup has been perceived as essential going all the way back to Microsoft's volume shadow service, which is over 10 years ago. I actually question whether using the EBS API is adequate. I mean, it gives you what some might call a crash consistent backup, equivalent to pulling the power cord out of a wall on a server. But there are many stateful apps that cache state in potentially memory and things like that, and they don't get an opportunity to flush before you make the backup. Also, any stateful app that is clustered, meaning multiple nodes are involved, typically you could have a real mess on your hands with something like this. What you want to do with that two-stage is inform the app that, hey, you should flush all your state down to the persistent disks ASAP, and then brown out service on any new transactions, because you don't want transactions that are half finished, update an index table and not what it points to or something. So what they'll do is they'll have inbound API calls, and they'll sit there knowing that this snapshot is about to take place. They won't necessarily fail a request. They'll just stall on responding to it and postpone it to give the snapshot time to get a repeatable state that's easy to recover from. Otherwise, it's true that these yank the power cord on the walls will recover something, but sometimes it's not deterministic what you're going to recover to, the exact point in time. And it might involve a rebuild step that tries to consolidate logs. The other thing that this two-step call is useful for is something called log truncation, where a lot of these things that tolerate yank the power cord out build up a transaction log, but it grows to infinity. And in other words, there's nothing that ever garbage collects it. And it's typical for backup solutions that have this two-stage to use that. You sometimes also want a signal back to the app that, yes, we made the snapshot, so then it can safely truncate the log. So I vote for this being perceived by users as an essential feature to be competitive with existing backup solutions for stateful apps that have been out there in the virtualization and bare metal world.
Okay,
anyway,
thanks.
That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I would say on the kind of consistency front, so Velero does support pre and post backup hooks, which are essentially user configurable commands that can be run in the pods that are being backed up, just prior to and just subsequent to triggering these snapshots. If there are application specific commands that need to be run to flush buffers or freeze incoming IOs, those should be configurable through the exec mechanism, which kind of plays into this workflow as well.
Okay, I guess that works then, except I believe that the Kubernetes storage SIG CSI continuum is working on a parallel solution to this inside CSI and Kubernetes storage SIG. So perhaps more generic where you wouldn't have to put Velero specific hooks in.
Yeah, there's SIG apps. Yeah, I think SIG apps is making like a CRD that's like execution hook.
Yeah, I think the storage SIG is working with SIG apps on this.
Yeah, and I think long term we need to look at that, but I haven't taken the time to look into it because I don't think that cap's accepted yet. I think it might be close. Maybe it is, but
I don't think it's removed. I think it's still sitting there.
It's still sitting. Okay, but yeah, you're right that there's a more generic way out there that we should look into.
You could do. I mean, whether it's finished or not, you could probably, by contributing work on it, which you might have to do anyway or already have done, you could probably take it over.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think we long term we would like to integrate with that if there is a standard way of doing it upstream, or potentially help make that happen. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't swap out our existing exec hook code for kind of the equivalent upstream approach to it. We do want to make sure that we don't want to only support CSI, at least not in the near term until that's the predominant solution. So we do want to make sure that we support non-CSI providers as well.
And so I know that the OpenABS guys have been really interested in this for a while now. Have any of the other storage providers taken a look at this? Thinking specifically about our own vSAN folks, as well as like the folks in Dell Tech and the Power Protect, because I think they both have voiced desire for this upload signal.
Yeah, so I did forward it to Dave Cheeta Smith, and so he took a look at it, provided a couple of comments on it, but I would like to continue to have other folks like that engage on it and help.
Yeah, I think I'll ping a couple of folks offline on this as well to draw their attention to it, because this is work that they're also interested in. And I think that if we can get a good deal of feedback from not only the open source community, but also some of the proprietary storage vendors, I think that would be helpful to make sure we have a good, well-rounded solution.
Not just, I think there may be potential not just for them contributing to, shall we say, the spec, but also given that both of those people have working backup solutions coming out of the VM world, they have developers who are experienced with this. I know the Dell EMC has an inventory of plugins for a lot of popular stateful apps. And they might be, the more interesting thing would be to get them to contribute developer hours to build this out. I did talk to both Dave and a bunch of the Dell EMC people last week at VMworld, and they are aware of this and interested in the subject. It struck me that the VMware storage might be more aligned with something matching up to CSI, because that's clearly the way they're going forward with the storage support. And
yeah, Dell's in a similar boat.
Yeah. By the way, with the Dell EMC people, I don't know if you have ever thought about this, but I was suggesting to the Dell EMC people that they might be interested in sending some developers to meetings like this. And in terms of even getting started, I broached the possibility that perhaps they could even take some of their Santa Clara resources and host a face-to-face meeting to get people to physically meet and interact with each other, because we used to do that over in the Kubernetes storage SIG, and I think it was a good way to break the ice and get people involved on a project. Anyway, I brought that up, and they seemed to, they didn't reject the possibility. They didn't say, sure, we'll provide a room and host it next month, but the response was pretty much, let's talk about this.
Yeah, we have Anthony on the call from Dell EMC.
Okay.
We've been talking to him about this. I don't know if you have anything you'd want to add, Anthony.
Yeah, thanks, Nolan. So I actually just saw this today, and I plan to forward this over to the guys that I work with within the Power Protect team. I know we talked about this in the last meeting we had, so it's something that we're definitely interested in, and as well as contributing back to it. So I'll forward this, and then probably they can add some more of their comments and feedback on it.
Thanks, Anthony. That sounds great. And, I don't know that this is necessarily something that we'll be able to get consensus on, really quickly, but it may make sense depending on kind of how many folks we can get interested in it to set up a little bit of a recurring meeting to just discuss the technical design and what the workflows look like for some of the different providers and make sure that we're getting to a design that makes sense overall. Unfortunately, Satyam, who wrote the initial doc, wasn't able to join us today. I think in a future meeting, we may have him join and actually walk through the document and kind of present his ideas and his thinking for the design that they proposed.
Did OpenABS indicate that they'd be willing to contribute developers to build it out?
I believe so. I believe they're pretty interested in getting this implemented, and so I think they were willing to contribute to it. All right, well, if there are no further comments on this one for now, I would say the action items are definitely for anyone who's interested to take a read through this proposal, and please add your comments. Continue to kind of circulate this to anyone who may be interested or may have input on it, and we'll continue to try and refine it and potentially set up some kind of recurring meeting to continue to discuss it in person. But I hope that we can continue to move this forward so that we can get to a better process for providers that would benefit from this. All right, so I'll switch to the second item that we had for open discussion. So this is issue 1687, which I have open in another tab here. So the quick background on this is that when Velero restores Kubernetes resources, prior to restoring them, it actually deletes the entire status field from those resources. So any of the subfields that exist within the status are cleared out. And so essentially when Velero is restoring those resources, it's just taking the spec of the object and applying it to the API. And there are kind of a number of different reasons that we did this, but at least for the upstream APIs, for the core Kubernetes APIs, when you create a resource, essentially anything that's in the status field is ignored by the API server anyway. The assumption is that if you are updating the status of an object, that you're specifically using the status sub-resource to update that. And so we've had a request come in and had a couple of different folks comment on it around the possibility of essentially removing that logic from Velero, so that particularly for custom resources, that if there is status information that's contained in the backup for those custom resources, that on restore, it just gets recreated with all of that existing status information. So yeah, I know a number of folks here have kind of read through this and had a little bit of back and forth. So I'll just pause there and see if anyone has any comments or questions on this issue.
I've just had one, I guess more of a question, is that if we do go ahead and make this change, is this something that would be an optional change? I'm just wondering, like, if we have plugins already that, for example, were written under the assumption that status was not restored, if we're suddenly restoring status, that could change behavior for existing plugins. Is that a concern?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern. I haven't had a lot of time to spend on this issue, but I would, off the top of my head, I would certainly think that we would want some way to toggle this behavior. I don't know whether it would be a kind of a global, like server level toggle, or whether it would be something that could be toggled for individual resource types or individual backups. But I definitely think that yeah, we would want to be able to disable this if it is something that we decide to pursue.
Yeah, I think this comes across to me as something that's specific to specific resources. So I don't think we'd want to enable it for every single resource. And it might just make sense to enable it on particular resources with just an annotation or something.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, well, of course, I need to read through this to know more, but I always think of the status fields as something that's a runtime attribute and not necessarily something that's supposed to be restored, but rather reconstituted by the system. So I'll take a look at like what specifically is being proposed here.
Yeah, and I agreed. Like, it seems like wanting to restore the status isn't like, to me, it seems like that's an anti-pattern in your app, but it's also, we've got a couple people that don't want to re-architect their applications just to get it backed up by Velero, which I think is fair. And I also, Scott brought up a good point that, like, if we just switch, I think that's like a major, like, if we made everything globally restore it, I would consider that a breaking API change. But yeah, if we can get selective and it's opt-in, that may quell those concerns.
I am personally more inclined to do this if we can do it with annotation like Adnan suggested, and not change the interface of the install or how we back up things. Just to help whoever is using this way, which.
Yeah, Scott, I know you've done at least some work, some work with actually backing up and restoring workloads that include CRDs. I'm curious if you've seen this as an issue or a limitation in any cases, or kind of what your view is on this request.
Yeah, and that's part of why I was asking the question about optional, because to be honest, I haven't really thought much about it lately, because that was one of the first things I learned in trying to write a plugin was you lose status. And we have some for OpenShift, our image stream stores a lot in the status field, and that was actually one of the reasons why we had put a request in to have available that original resource with status field, not to back up, but so the plugin could use data in it. But because we weren't restoring the status field, our plugin uses that information in the restore, but it turns out we don't really need that in the restore, so it was okay, because those images that we're restoring, again, the cluster is going to recreate that. So it's kind of an unknown right now. If we did restore that, what would happen? Because I haven't tested it, because that's one of these things where if we were going to add support for this, the first approach would be just leave it alone for our plugins. We don't want it because we're not using it and it works, but it's something we'd probably look into once it's available. Okay, does this help us out? Does this make the logic for our plugin simpler, because we don't have to go into that old object, the sort of object from backup, or is it really better the way it is, assuming that the target cluster is going to restore that status automatically?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think this would be worth a design proposal to say, explore options on what, if you use an annotation, what do you annotate? If you put it on a backup, is it just a field that's like a Boolean that controls the behavior of all resources covered by that backup or by that restore? It may be actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it would probably be a restore time flag, not a backup time flag. But it seems to me like it's useful for people, But also, I think we need to talk through what the implementation looks like to get a read on, like if we do annotations, what do we annotate? Do we annotate a specific resource, or do we annotate the CRD or all things of that class, kind? So yeah, I think that would be the next step in my mind.
I think you want it to be granular, at least to the level of the resource or the CRD, because again, I'm just thinking in terms of if you have custom plugins, you might have some plugins that want to make use of this, and others that, you know, you really don't want to mess with this. You want to leave status empty, and not, you know, the whole restore as a whole, everything or nothing.
Yeah, I'd agree. And just brainstorming here, but if you could put an annotation in the target resource saying either do this or not, it would prove that whoever put that there had rights, because permissions might be a hairy issue here, where you don't want somebody having uber authority through a backup to overwrite things. So that if this was driven by an annotation in the target that you could put moments before you were about to do the restore, that might work out really well.
Well,
Yeah,
if it was,
it's a good idea.
Yeah, and if it was an annotation, it would have to happen before the backup.
Well, no.
Resource wouldn't exist when you're doing the restore.
Well, I guess you're right, although I suppose you could create a shadow, but if you were restoring hundreds of them, yeah, that might be a pain.
Yeah,
I mean, there's two use cases of restoring from not on top of nothing and then restoring on existing. So if it was existing, I think putting the annotation in the existing so that it can control the extent of potential overwrite would make sense. But if it was empty, then a less granular approach makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm definitely interested to, you know, and I'll comment on this issue, but just to hear from the couple of folks who have requested this, I'd be interested just to see some of the specific sort of fields or information that's stored in status that needs to be restored. I'd like to understand those details before pursuing it, because I don't know how, you know, widespread this need is. The original issue creator talked about Rancher and I think some Rancher CRDs, and then we had another comment from, I think, someone who works for SAP or some SAP subsidiary. So I'd definitely like to hear their specific use cases here.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to dig deeper into the use case.
But I do think that, you know, going through a design doc is the right kind of process for this, since it's not, it's potentially an easy code change to make, but has far-ranging consequences. So we definitely want to think through it. All right, does anyone else have any other comments or questions on this? All right, so I'll switch to the third issue that we have, issue 1027 here around self-signed certs. So this is an issue that we've had in the backlog for a while, basically around being able to use Velero with self-signed certs and potentially provide, you know, needing to provide custom CA bundles as connections are being set up. More recently, we had a PR that was submitted to basically add an insecure skip verify flag that would allow kind of TLS verification to be bypassed. We chose not to, the PR came in at the very end of the 1.1 cycle. We definitely did not want to include it in the 1.1 release. But we also had some concerns about whether it even made sense to allow this this option to skip verification, and so this issue has gotten a number of commenters on you know, what the appropriate approach is, whether we should allow custom CA bundles to be provided, and if we do that, how exactly we should do that, or whether we should allow this flag for skipping verification. So again, I'll pause there and see if anyone has any questions or comments on this. I think we definitely want to have a solution for folks who are in this situation. It seems to come up a fair amount with Minio endpoints, and so we'd like to have a way for folks to be able to have a good workflow here. But I think the concern around adding the insecure skip verify flag is that it will end up being sort of abused or used by folks without necessarily thinking through all of the implications. And so I think, the team probably in general would prefer to go down the route of allowing custom CA bundles to be provided and using that as an approach that, certainly is more secure. But that's, that places additional demands on the user as far as configuration and potentially has implications not just on the Velero server, but also on the clients. So if we do go down that path, we definitely need to think about kind of what the UX is there and how to make it kind of a seamless process for users.
Yeah, to me, it seems like we might just want to do both and just recommend that people use the custom CA option over the insecure skip verify. Maybe just have like a warning whenever you use that one. But I wouldn't necessarily not do it just because we're scared of people abusing it. Also, tools like kubectl and others also support this option. And so I don't think it's that bad to necessarily have it.
Yeah, and it would definitely, yeah, like you said, like kubectl offers it as an option. So it would be kind of consistent, at least with some of the main ecosystem tools in that regard. I do think obviously we can put big scary warnings in the help text for the flag. I don't know if there are, if we choose to include that, if there are other ways that we can make sure that folks are aware that it's an insecure option.
And I think we're probably indirectly supporting it with the Kubernetes connection, because client Go will just read the config file and read that insecure flag on the kube config. So if we're supporting it through that, it seems like.
Although I think this is more so that's between the Velero client and the Kubernetes cluster, which is one vector. And then I think this issue is specifically about to the object store.
Yeah, but my point is just if we're supporting it for the Kubernetes client, it seems
right.
Not support it for.
Right, then it's a little asymmetrical that we kind of have. Yeah, we have that open on the cube side, but not on the object store side.
One thing to think about, or at least one thing that I think about, is because we don't have multi-tenancy, so you can make backups. Whoever has the permissions to make backups has permissions to restore things, and just the role-based actions that Velero is allowing. And I'm just trying to think of a malicious case where somebody would, use an unsigned or something like this to back up things to storage and be able to just restore. I don't know what the issues would be, but that's the sort of direction that I'll be thinking about.
Okay, well, it sounds like, we're obviously gonna have to come to a decision here on which approaches we're gonna pursue. Certainly the code for the insecure skip verify flag has already been written and submitted in this PR. So if we do decide to accept that, we'll just need to make sure that that code looks reasonable. If we decide not to accept it, then I think we, we'll probably want to put forth a design proposal for the alternate approach. Make sure that that works for folks who are in this scenario. Yeah, again, I would say for anyone who has any other inputs or is in this situation, please add comments or questions on this issue 1027 here, and we'll try and get to a resolution here in a timely manner. All right, well, that effectively concludes our agenda. I guess just two things to kind of wrap up. So we've had the Velero user and Velero community survey out for the last month or so, a month or two, and we just closed that at the end of last week. And so we will be working on kind of collating the responses and getting those in a format where we can publish them out so that everyone can kind of see the results of those. We're hoping that we can use those responses to help inform our roadmap going forward. So we're definitely excited about kind of analyzing that data and seeing what it tells us. So stay tuned for that in the coming weeks and months. And then beyond that, yeah, we're definitely excited to have folks continue to join us in the Slack channel or in any of the other kind of community channels. So if you're using Velero, if you're new to Velero, please come join us. Ask questions, answer questions, just be a part of the community there, and that'll help us continue to evolve. And so with that, I'll open it up one more time for any comments or questions that anyone else has.
Yeah, I actually had another comment. I was discussing with Nolan on Friday. The issue was when you're doing a restore with include cluster resources set to auto, to nil. My expectation was that if you had a CR that you were restoring, or actually the backup, but if you're backing up a CR, the appropriate CRD would be pulled in as well. I know if you set include cluster resources to false, you don't get anything, and if you set it to true, you get all of them. Going into the code, we realized that there's no code actually written to do that. I opened an issue 1830, and I also have a PR that I linked to that seems to work, but may need some style or efficiency work. But just wanted to bring that up. I don't know if you just you want to look at this and talk about it offline later. But it was anyway. That's that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was on PTO on Friday, so
Yep.
I was just kind of catching up on it.
Got
this
it.
morning, but Nolan mentioned it to me, but I would, it sounds like having that behavior is definitely consistent with the include cluster resources flag. Unfortunately, we don't really have a generic mechanism for identifying, when there's an associated cluster scoped resource that should be included.
Yep.
So
I know you're doing PVs as a special case, and so my PR is another special case for CRDs, and like you said, I don't know of any way of doing it other than a special case. So, have a look. When you have a chance, we'll figure it out whether that makes sense or a different approach is better.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Definitely. Sounds like it makes sense. So, we'll look and see if we can get that merged.
And slightly related to this, there was an previously existing issue where if CRD is restored and then immediately you restore a CR, but the CRD is not ready yet, sometimes it fails. I know there was some discussion, I think this was months ago, there hasn't been any movement on that issue in a while as to longer term solutions around resource, either retrying or wait. I was also wondering if it would seem like a shorter term, kind of more targeted solution might be possible if we had a notion of a after restore backup action. Because right now the restore actions go before backup. I know I saw an issue again a year or so ago of the possibility of having a plugin that would run after the backup, or after the restore. That might allow this to work for making sure CRDs were ready.
Yeah. So if we had that kind of plugin, is the idea that you would basically restore the custom resource definition, and then you would have kind of a post plugin that would wait for it to be ready before moving on?
My thinking was that because you already have CRDs in that prioritized list, that you could write a post-restore CRD plugin that would just wait to see that the resource that we just restored is ready. And so the only places you'd be waiting would be on CRD restores rather than, on everything. Because without doing that, the only other way that I can do it in a plugin would be to have a plugin that runs on every single resource we restore. And if it's a custom resource, wait for the CRD. And that's obviously a lot more waiting in places that we're checking. And the other thing you could do would be, again, treat CRDs as a special case that's handled directly in the code. And at some point where we're restoring those CRDs, actually have code in Velero itself that's waiting for that. But that's where I thought some of that long-standing GitHub issue was talking about. And the discussions were moving more in the direction of a more general, linking of related resources and all that, rather than something more targeted to just CRDs. Yeah.
I don't know that I've necessarily looked at that issue recently, so I can definitely catch up on it. But I think if we do have other use cases for post-restore plugins,
there is an issue I saw there was some discussion on as well. It looked like for that use case having to do with pod restore and databases, I got the impression from the discussion that this wasn't really the right solution for that. But in a more general case of something like the restore plugin action but runs after restore, that because then you could just write up CRD plugin, whether you included it in core or it was just separate standalone, ought to handle that use case. And there may be other use cases where you'd want a post restore plugin. I just don't know of any right now that we've hit.
Okay. Yeah. And, we could also think about, having kind of a multi-phased approach here where maybe it's just kind of expedient to implement something like this within the core Velero code for now. We can kind of make sure it works and then think about adding post-restore plugin support as a separate thing and kind of have a plan to migrate that special case logic in there. Just because, adding new plugins is certainly more overhead than just adding
the API. I mean, you have post-restore special casing already with PVCs and pods, and it might just be one more kind of block in that code, post-restore, to check if it's a CRD, then wait for it or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we already have other special case logic around PVs and PVCs, like if they're terminating and you try to make it back up, or I forget when it is, but we've got like a check for if they're terminating. I think it's on restore. So if they're terminating, wait to restore them, and it like walks from a PV to a PVC to a namespace if any of those are in a terminating state. So yeah, we've got precedent for that kind of logic. It's just where to put it.
I'm curious, is this something that you're working around currently, Scott, or how are you kind of handling these situations?
It was one of these things that just came through with one of our testers who was realizing that, they were testing a case with an operator, which isn't an OpenShift operator, it was not something we're actually supporting yet, but we were realizing that just more generally, if you have an application with custom resources, we realized that the CRDs weren't even in the backup at all. And so that was what precipitated this, the issue that I put in. And then as I was testing my attempted solution, I realized that while it worked on the backup included it when it needed to and all that, I was getting, sporadic restore failures. And if this is a specialized case with very little in it, and it's just, here's a resource, here's a CRD. So that's where you hit that race condition pretty often because there's not a whole lot else it's doing. So it's pretty common to get to that point where it's not ready. So, I hadn't gotten any further than that. I figured I'd, get the CRD and the backup first, and then I'd worry about the next step, which is, and the answer may be something similar, but instead of, because the PR that I put out there over the weekend is, obviously on the backup side to sort of pull things in the backup resource method, and it would probably be an equivalent spot, whether maybe in the restore item or something, right after we called restore, in the same place that we're checking in certain things, if it's PVC or if it's a PV or a namespace, and there might be a block there that we would just need to check and wait for. If it's a CRD, is it ready?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I think we have had a couple of other reports of this issue before, and I think we've generally recommended, at least as a workaround, just kind of do two restores in a row, where your first restore is specifically just restoring the custom resource definitions, and then essentially manually wait for those things to be ready, and then trigger another restore for the custom resources themselves.
Yeah, and I hadn't gotten to the point of figuring out whether how much work that would be to work with our controller to do that versus work to get something in Velero directly. That's where, because until they're included in the backup, none of that's relevant anyway. So that was the first step, is to get those CODs into the backups. Now, once that's in the backup, then the question of whether we want to get something into Velero that fixes this relatively soon, or whether it's easier just to go back and do the multiple backup. But I'd rather avoid the multiple passes in the back, because we're already doing two-stage backup and restore with handling PVs versus everything else, and so that would just add more complexity on our end to have another pass just to handle the CRDs. There's nothing that would prevent us from doing that other than wanting to avoid that complexity if we could.
Yeah, that makes total sense. We can definitely kind of pick up discussion on these and try and get to an approach, and then figure out where we can fit it in, or see if if you all have time to contribute, or if anyone else is interested in contributing here.
Sure.
Okay. Well, thanks for bringing that up.
No problem.
All right. Does anyone else have anything before we drop for the day? Okay, well, thanks a lot, everyone. Appreciate you joining us. And just a reminder, we have moved to a monthly community meeting cadence. So the next community meeting will be the first Tuesday of October. So we'll see everyone in about 4 weeks.
See you, folks.
Bye.